What's striking about Trump is that he can often cut through what you might call the obfuscations of normal diplomacy. The Biden administration provided massive support for Ukraine, but never really tried, at least in public, to impose any conditions or press the Zelensky government for any alternative to total victory, to develop ideas for an armistice or a peace agreement, to move on from a war that Ukraine has not been able to, quote, win. So the change of administration has made it possible for the United States to move things along.
Hello and welcome to the Creating History podcast and our series exploring pivotal summit meetings when leaders, strategy and history collide on the world stage. I'm Russell Barnes, producer of television documentaries and now podcasts.
And I'm David Reynolds, author and historian at Cambridge University.
In the last episode, we explored the unconventional diplomacy of American President Donald Trump in his first term as 45th president, and how he made use of his reluctant break from office from 2021 to 2025 to plot a comeback and a radical shake-up of American government and institutions in his second term as 47th president. In this episode, we're going to look at what that means for international relations and in the process draw together some recurring themes about diplomacy and Summitry from our series. We'll also answer some questions that listeners have sent in. So David, we're recording today on the 2nd of May 2025. 100 days of the second Trump administration has just passed. It's a good moment to take stock. When it comes to Trump 2.0's foreign policy and approach to Summitry, how much of a reset do you think is going on?
Well, despite the whirlwind pace, the deliberately whirlwind pace that I think it's intended to wrong-foot would-be critics, we're only in the third month of 2.0. There have been no major diplomatic breakthroughs yet, certainly not the revolutions on day one that he was promising and predicting as he was in 2017 when he came to power in the first term. But I think the first 100 days of 2.0 have revealed the extent of Trump's ambitions to rewrite American history, the expansiveness of his agenda. Now, most presidents, and I think most political leaders, like to sign off their political careers with a legacy project, maybe 2 or 3 such projects. And Trump, with his love of what he calls big, beautiful deals, will be no exception. And of course, there's the recurrent references about his craving for a Nobel Peace Prize, though with the usual protective disclaimer that they'll never give it to me. But I think maybe we heard an opening pitch on the 5th of February 2025 when Trump met Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House. Remember those remarkable comments to the press, comments which surprised even Trump's closest allies, that the US would, quote, take over the Gaza Strip, quote, resettle people permanently, and then turn Gaza into what Trump called the Riviera of the Middle East. Now, that pitch was truly a work of art.
Yes, or was this madman tactics again? A sly way to really shake things up by publicly dismissing both the Palestinian and Israeli historic claims on the land. It took even Netanyahu, I think, by surprise.
Well, maybe, but let's be clear. If Gaza is internationalized and developed by the United States, while Trump endorses Israel's creeping annexation of the West Bank, that double whammy, if you like, will end any hope of Palestinian statehood in what's ironically called this twice promised land. It would be a complete farewell to the two-state solution. And I think there's also a domestic problem for Trump here in any kind of deal like this, a problem that really in some ways makes it fanciful, because this vision of just clearing and developing Gaza would require US muscle, American boots on the ground, and that could easily lead to problems with his political base. because Trump's popularity in MAGA circles is built on his promise to disentangle the US from foreign forever wars. Direct intervention in Gaza could easily be another quagmire and probably would be seen as a betrayal by his supporters.
Talking of promises, let's talk about Ukraine. Putin's invasion on the 24th of February 2022 has led to 3 years now of bloody and attritional warfare in eastern and southern Ukraine. Under President Biden, NATO supplied the Ukrainians so they could keep fighting, but not to an extent that Ukraine could push the Russians out. And Trump came into his second term promising he could end the Ukraine war on day one. Another piece of Trumpian hyperbole, of course.
Yep.
But he does seem to talk sincerely of his desire to bring an end to the war. And, he's claimed that it's led to 1 million killed or wounded. What's your assessment of his peace efforts so far?
Well, what's striking about Trump and his initiatives is that he can often cut through what you might call the obfuscations of normal diplomacy. The Biden administration provided massive support for Ukraine, but never really tried, at least in public, to impose any conditions or press the Zelensky government for any alternative to total victory. And it's unlikely that Biden, given that massive commitment, would ever have been able to do anything to pull back, to develop ideas for an armistice or a peace agreement, to move on from a war that Ukraine has not been able to, quote, win. So the change of administration has made it possible for the United States to move things along. Now, there have been attempts by Trump's emissaries to broker temporary ceasefires and to try to define a territorial settlement that would involve major concessions to Russia, including not allowing Ukraine to join NATO. Trump's critics claim that he's trying to end the war at almost any cost, even appeasing the aggressor, an aggressor who deliberately invaded a sovereign state and a member of the UN, seeking to overthrow its government. That's what was happening in February 2022. More striking still, and this is what has really shaken foundations in Europe, Trump appeared to change sides. He made a turn towards Russian President Vladimir Putin and away from NATO's unqualified support for Ukraine ever since 2022. And this was signaled in the most dramatic way by that White House meeting on the 28th of February of this year, when Ukraine's President Zelensky visited Washington to sign a minerals deal with the United States in return for past and future American support. He didn't get to sign that deal and was then ambushed at a press call in the Oval Office by Trump and his Vice President, J.D. Vance.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary moment in front of the world's media. The kind of unguarded scene which has happened at summits that we've discussed, but always firmly behind closed doors.
Yes.
Here, the one-upmanship was performed in public, and it was really excruciating to watch at times.
Yeah. Relations between Trump and Zelensky have since recovered somewhat. And indeed, their two governments have just signed that deal on joint exploitation of Ukraine's mineral wealth. And the current version that's just been signed was one in which Trump did not get all he wanted. We also have to acknowledge that he's had hissy fits with Putin over Russian foot-dragging on ending the war. But nothing has been agreed as we speak in early May 2025, and the noises from the White House at the moment are that this war could not be ending very quickly at all, and then maybe Trump might lose interest. So clearly there's no quick fix, as Trump categorically promised. And it's worth thinking back to a similarly bitter conflict, the Korean War, which reminds us of how difficult it is to end a really bitter entrenched conflict. It took 2 years to reach an armistice between North Korea and South Korea, and it was something like 500 meetings in that process. So that reminds us of just how unsimple it is to create a peace out of this kind of conflict. What's more, any kind of guaranteed peace for Ukraine, one that's not going to involve Ukraine's admission to NATO, which is an absolute red line for Putin, is still going to require American guarantees. American muscle again, because the US is the only major nuclear power in NATO, and therefore the only country that is going to be taken seriously by another big nuclear power, albeit a struggling one, namely Putin's Russia. So this version of making America great again will require more boss stuff support. Again, how will that square with Trump's base?
This week on True Criminals, Fugitives.
There's no way in my mind my dad could have been a bad guy, so...
What did your mum tell you?
Well, first of all, my dad came into my room because I looked out of the window wondering what was going on, and I heard someone shout, "There he is," and I looked down and there was a lot of police outside my bedroom window. There was a lot of journalists and taking pictures, and I thought, what is going on? This is most unusual. Then my dad walked in with Tommy Butler, and he just said, "Look, son, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Daddy's been a very naughty boy."
Join Sky News crime correspondent Martin Brunt and journalist Helen Fospero on True Criminals, a weekly deep dive into the cases that shook the world, with insights so shocking they still haunt our imagination today. This is True Criminals.
You know him as a British bulldog and World War II hero, but who was the real Winston Churchill? New history podcast Creating Churchill explores the man behind the myth, how Churchill's life and legacy were shaped by relationships with tricky allies like Roosevelt and Stalin, enemies including Hitler and Gandhi, and his wife and most devoted critic, Clemmy. With fresh psychological insight and untold stories, Creating Churchill, available now on your favourite podcast app.
When it comes to NATO, foreign policy under Trump 2.0 seems to be picking up where he left off with 1.0, undermining the international architecture.
Yes, there's a real and historic shake-up of NATO underway. America's NATO allies in Europe have been the bedrock of US foreign policy since 1949, but it's becoming clear that they can no longer rely on the US, that they will have to do much, much more for their own defense, which, in fairness to Trump, they've largely ignored since the 1990s. They have not made a big effort on defense. And so, in a way, you could say Trump is using Ukraine as a wake-up call to European members of NATO to get their act together, spend more on defense. And that has indeed resulted in real movement. In Britain, for instance, there's been pledged and a strong commitment to allocate a higher percentage of government spending on defense. Most strikingly, Germany's new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has secured a major parliamentary deal to reverse Germany's low-key defense policy that it had followed really since the 1940s in atonement for Germany's Nazi past. And this process of re-evaluating and re-emphasizing defense is going to continue across NATO Europe.
Yeah, and what I find striking about all of this is the change of tone with America's democratic allies. It's almost anti-diplomacy from the White House. We've talked about the car crash of the Zelensky showdown in the Oval Office, but there's been other rattling of allies. J.D. Vance's strident critique at the Munich Security Conference, for instance, of what he views as European backsliding on free speech.
Yes, and that reminds us that there's a social agenda here as well as a military one, if you like, and Vance is talking about that. He's taking aim at the diversity, equity and inclusion policies that he just loves to denounce. He did so at Munich, he's done it elsewhere. And it's part of the so-called manosphere agenda that animates him and other Trumpists like Donald Jr., built around the superiority, as they see it, of white alpha males, for whom manliness at times looks like almost a synonym for just sheer nastiness. So it's very unpleasant, it's very aggressive, and deliberately so. And of course, behind this, Trump's main interest now does seem to be forging a special relationship with Putin. reviving those 1.0 hopes from 2017-18 that he had. He's clearly still fascinated by this autocrat in the Kremlin and the achievement of Putin, who managed to really resurrect the Russian Empire from the ash heap of history in 1989-91 and make it great or seem great once again. So Trump genuinely craves a special relationship with almost a man he sees as an international magician. And that, in his mind, requires pressuring Ukraine to make peace. He appears indifferent to Putin's blatant invasion of a sovereign state. You know, he's an absolute practitioner, lover of realpolitik. Or maybe we should say realtorpolitik, because what he's interested, I think, is making the world safe for property development rather than democracy in the way that Woodrow Wilson spoke of. And I wonder whether the Gaza Riviera is going to be followed by the Crimean Riviera in Trump's game plan.
Indeed. And one strong continuity I see from Trump 1.0 to 2.0 is, frankly, chaos and inconsistency. The impression that the president flip-flops depending on who he's spoken to last. We've seen through the series the value of the Sherpa, the Henry Kissinger-like figure who hammers out the outlines of deals in advance of a summit. But does Trump perhaps have too many Sherpas who are not very well managed by him? On Ukraine, for instance, we have Peace Envoy General Kellogg, who's been trying to limit territorial concessions to Russia, while Presidential Envoy Steve Witkoff sweet-talks Putin in Moscow. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been negotiating that strategic minerals deal with Ukraine. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been trying to normalize relations with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. All at the same time, arrangements overlapping. You said in our first episode on Trump that he talks about always moving. I'm moving in both directions. But I have to say, is all that movement productive, or is this really a case of a kind of busy fool syndrome?
Look, I think Trump has a remarkable ability not to be caught on hooks that would trap most normal politicians. And of course, the constant movement is not productive of good governance, but that's about the last thing on Trump's agenda. He thrives on chaos. He uses it constantly to keep critics off balance so that their targets just keep shifting. It is not consistent in the kind of comment and attacks that they can make.
Yeah. Well, we've had some very appreciative comments and questions in from listeners, which we're very grateful for. Linda from Bedford wrote to us. She was struck by our episodes Nutcracker about Kennedy and Khrushchev and Bushwhacking about Bush and Blair, and how chaotic the personal diplomacy of these leaders seemed, often making it up as they went along. Perhaps we shouldn't expect Trump to be any different.
Well, I think Linda makes a good point because, let's be honest, historians do have a tendency to try and tidy up the past. And one value of looking at original sources, especially diaries from the time, is to get a flavour of how messy things looked and felt at that time. Often the so-called policy makers were frankly making it up as they went along. And of course, they certainly made it up all over again when they wrote their memoirs. And I often cite the saying of a distinguished historian of medieval England, nothing to do with Summitry, a man called F.W. Maitland. But he said, we have to remember that events now long in the past were once in the future. In other words, you, Russell, me, David, our listeners, don't know what's going to happen in our lives next month. And world leaders are generally no different.
Yeah. Another major policy shift that isn't technically foreign policy, but does have a big impact on America's foreign relations, is around tariffs. Liberation Day, 2nd of April 2025, or perhaps we might call it the Trump shock, saw a raft of tariffs being placed on trading partners of America, allies and economic competitors as well. But the main target seems to be China. Trump 2.0 seems fixated on an economic reset with China and isolating it economically.
Yes, Trump 2.0's rolling back the free trade principles that have generally guided US foreign policy since 1945. Trump's denounced them as a sellout of American interests. He's extolled a late 19th century philosophy of imposing high tariffs to protect domestic manufacturing against cheaper imports. He's even touted the idea that tariff income on goods could replace federal income tax on workers, and that was first imposed in 1913, generally thought of as a progressive way of handling taxation, but in Trump's view, a major historical mistake. Now, he played the tariff card in his first term, but in the second term, he's done so really frantically, threatening to spark a global tariff war. China and America have now ratcheted up tariffs against each other over 100%, even 200%. Again, it's a move that's totally shattered international goodwill and undermined the world stock market.
Yeah, I mean, the tariff war doesn't seem to be going as planned.
No, China hasn't caved in, and it may well be that China's economic success is no longer so dependent on its export economy, certainly with the United States. Its biggest challenge at the moment is to boost consumer spending at home and deal with the huge glut of surplus property that's driven down the value of people's houses. And this also takes us back to that earlier point about whether policy making is coherent. Tariffs and China are obsessions for Trump. And so he recruited what we might call a maverick economist from California, some would say a quack economist, a man called Pete Navarro, who shared those obsessions about China and tariffs. And Navarro proved his loyalty to Trump and Trump's specious claim to have won the 2020 election by actually going to jail for 4 months because of contempt of Congress. Now, that's the kind of blind devotion that Trump wants. So in 2025, he gave Navarro a free hand in designing the tariff scenario with its self-destructive damage to trade. I've seen a recent report which suggests that it was only through desperate backstage maneuvering that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was able to get the ear of Trump and persuade him to authorize a 90-day freeze, which is really a U-turn in all but name. And there may well be more U-turns to come if, as is now being predicted, shortages actually start to appear on the shelves of chain stores like Walmart and Target, which is where Trump's supporters do much of their shopping.
Yeah, I wonder if the likely tariff retreat points at something else going on in America's relations with the world. Put simply, America can't afford to be the world's policeman any longer. There's $36 trillion in publicly held Treasury debt, and then you've got Social Security and Medicare running deficits, which will add further liabilities, huge liabilities. International bond markets are sensing that weakness and demanding a high premium for 10-year American treasuries. So if we look past the Trumpian bluster, perhaps the real agenda for making deals, for cutting government and disengaging from forever wars is a retreat from a unipolar world to a world of multipolarity where great powers once again have distinctive spheres of influence. And that's perhaps why Trump has joked about Canada as a 51st state and expressed his desire to annex Greenland. The idea of the American hemisphere is coming back in vogue.
Well, on Canada, of course, the joke is now on him after the remarkable anti-Trump Liberal victory in the recent elections. But on the hemisphere as a whole, I think you may well be right. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a former foe of Trump, but now a leading ally in international diplomacy, suggested a spheres of influence approach to global politics in an interview early on in the new administration in January of this year. He said, at the end of the Cold War, because we were the only power in the world, we assumed the responsibility of becoming the global government in many cases, trying to solve every problem. But, he added, it's not normal for the world to simply have a unipolar power. That was an anomaly. And that comment does suggest a more isolationist or at least self-contained approach to the US, which means recognizing regional powers like China and Russia as having sway within their own area. But the problem, again, is when those spheres of influence rub up against each other, what then do you do? How do you react? And that's why I think it's very difficult to imagine a spheres of influence agreement between major powers that are serious competitors, particularly the US and China, without you having to bring in and think about as well some kind of military force or threat of military force in order to protect and advance one's spheres of influence.
Well, we've outlined the likely shape of Trump's 2.0 New World Order. Where do you think Summitry fits into it?
Well, probably not centre stage in the way that it was in the first term, because then he was really running around the world trying to attract attention. In his second term, he doesn't need it to attract attention. Let the world come to him, and in fact, they're queuing up to do so. Hopefully, we won't get another Munich, who knows? But I think we can predict with confidence that the era of Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin is becoming ancient history.
Indeed. Trump famously or infamously seems to do a lot of his diplomacy by social media post, berating foreign leaders in particular, making diplomacy a kind of rolling soap opera. Do you think the immediacy and quickfire narrative building of social media undercuts the power that face-to-face meetings at the top used to have?
Well, those classic diplomatic set pieces of the past developed almost in slow motion over a number of days, captured by just a few forms of media that were often controlled by states or major corporations. And that slow motion set piece sense of Summitry is why many of them have stuck in the public mind. But even in our own, if you like, socially mediated kaleidoscopic world, some things still stick. And I think the ambush of Zelensky in the Oval Office is one of those. As Trump chortled afterwards, this is going to be great television.
Carrie from California wrote into us to say how struck she was by our reassessment of Ronald Reagan and, to a lesser extent, Richard Nixon in our episodes End of the Evil Empire and Nixon Dances, and how they made positive strides forward in the Cold War. She asks, I think possibly tongue-in-cheek, whether historians will be doing the same thing for Donald Trump in 40 to 50 years.
Well, I think that it's true that what we see in retrospect is that even people who might look to us really appalling actually have managed to achieve certain things on the international stage. But I think really I'm just going to give a straight, not tongue-in-cheek answer to Carrie here. I don't know, because in 40 or 50 years, I won't be around. And as the economist John Maynard Keynes once said in 1923 when asked about long-range predictions, in the long run, we are all dead.
Finally, David, several of our listeners have asked essentially the same question, the top Trump's question, if you like. Of the leaders we've discussed in this series, who do you rate as the most accomplished summiteers and why? And who would you not want on your team at the summit?
Well, it's interesting to recall a comment of Anthony Eden, not the most successful British Prime Minister, though certainly, shall we say, trumping Liz Truss. But Eden had done years as Foreign Secretary, and in his memoirs, published in 1965, Eden wrote this. He said, after something like 30 years' experience of international conferences of one kind or another, if I had to pick a team for going into the conference room, Stalin would be my first choice. He was, said Eden, ruthless, always knew what he wanted, hooded, calm, never raising his voice, seldom even seeming irritated, and never wasting a word. Now, of course, Stalin would never be on my team, nor would the man I would regard as the number one non-team player, the current president of the United States. But talking positively, I still have a soft spot for the two intertwined double acts of the 1980s. Ronald Reagan and Secretary of State George Shultz on the one hand, and Mikhail Gorbachev and his foreign minister Eduard Shevardnadze on the other. Their teamwork got things done. But of course, I think we might need to remember what's going on in the background here. Soviet power was in retreat by the late 1980s, and Gorbachev by then was frankly doing himself out of a job. So deal-making became a bit one-sided, rather than it being a real negotiation between equals. Having said that, frankly, I still have a continued respect for a man who has proved a total aberration among Russian leaders. Gorbachev came to understand the importance of what he called all human values, all-human values, values that embraced all men and women and added dignity to their lives, regardless of nationalism, ideology, and so on, across all humanity. That's a far cry from the values of the man who's the current, shall we say, life tenant of the Kremlin, and also a far cry from the worldview of a few other world figures who I won't mention.
Perhaps I can flip this question around and suggest a rogues gallery of the weakest summiteers we've discussed. Neville Chamberlain, determined to see what he wanted to see in Adolf Hitler. Less obvious, but really striking in our Nutcracker episode about the Vienna Summit of 1961. John F. Kennedy proved a poor summiteer, high on drugs much of the time, and choking his big moment. But I think I'd nominate at the bottom of the league George W. Bush and Tony Blair, who we discussed in episode 10. Their hubris and shift away from realism undermine the credibility of so much international architecture, the UN, weapons inspection protocols, even the International Criminal Court. The damage done by the neocon moment in the early 21st century is really being paid for today in the Middle East and in a more deeply politicized United Nations that's a peripheral bystander to international crises like Ukraine.
I agree, Russell, and this is another example of why this is such fertile territory to think about much larger issues of international politics. Summitry has been a lens into really the changing shape of our world over the last century, and that's why it's been fun to talk about, and it will be fun for people to keep on talking about.
Well, thank you, David, for your insights, as ever. And thank you, listeners, for joining us for this discussion about Donald Trump's foreign policy and the final episode of our series on historic summits. Creating History will be taking a break over the summer, but we hope to be back with a new series later in the year. Till then, goodbye. You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating History. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. It really helps us get the word out and extend our reach. You can follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there or by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Also, do check out our first series, Creating Churchill, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to buy us or the team a coffee at ko-fi.com, we'd be very grateful. Details of how to donate are in the podcast description. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating History is a Clear Story production.